Welcome you all for the session Macroeconomic Policies. So, the macroeconomic policies refers to the action taken by the government through the different policies to achieve the macroeconomic objectives of the economy. The total economy, how it is going to be grow, and the development which will be focused more on this particular policies, we call it as macroeconomic policies. These macro goals, which includes the economic growth, economic development, full employment, equality in distribution of income, controlling the inflation in the economy through maintaining price stability, and other parameters are also taken for improving the economy. The most popular economic policies are the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. So the macroeconomic policies refers to the action taken by the government through the different policies to achieve its macroeconomic objectives of the economy. There are the two important policies which will deals with. The first one is a monetary policy. The monetary policy is an operation of the government. Is basically the monetary authorities of the country and operate through the changes in the quantity of money. Thus, the immediate impact is felt in the money market. Whereas the fiscal policy is on another hand where the fiscal policy is in the operations of the government, where it is focusing on the changes in the government expenditure and tax collections. Thus, its immediate impact on the goods market. Before the Second World War, the government's role should be in minimum, and the economic functions are focusing on the principles of invisible hand maintained by the it is as mentioned by Adam Smith in his famous book published in the year 1776, Wealth of Nations. With the advent of Keynes, the role of government in achieving the macroeconomic objectives was realized. The authorities in the United States and other countries are realized as how to measure the impact and the role of government which plays in achieving the growth of economy in terms of generation of employment and bringing the price stability into the market. The laws were passed in many countries underlying the importance of government in different economic policies. Though there were still doubt and different relating to the extent of responsibilities of the government should assigned in achieving the different goals. To what extent the government has been successful in achieving the macroeconomic objectives is the period subject to open debate and differing from country to country. The importance of the government cannot be undermined even today's world. Hence, it is the thing you need to examine and evaluate the role of government while formulating the various policies. The objectives of macroeconomic policy. So, what are the important objectives are taken under the macroeconomic policies? The objectives of macroeconomic policies are different from country to country. While an underdeveloped country may aim at the growth and the development, as industrialized country is focusing on providing employment or at achieving the situation near to full employment, and also the price stability by keeping the inflation under the control. Hence, the policy makers in different countries have considered the major aspects while framing these policies. There are the major objectives of macroeconomic policies are: the first one, high and sustainable economic growth. In the simplest term, the economic growth can be defined as increase in economic output. Output is the real GNP, is a gross national product. The word real implying that the effectiveness of inflation, prevailing inflation, have been adjusted so far. And sometimes the GDP, the gross domestic product, is used to quite similar to the GNP. The economic growth can be defined as the increase in economy's output over the period of time. If the real GNP, gross national product, is corrected for the increase in the population, another useful concept of economic growth, the real GNP per capita can be obtained. From the real GNP per capita varies it between the different economies, and various other related concepts of economic growth can be arrived. Each of the emphasis focusing on the economic growth. For example, the real consumption per capita indicates that the growth of economic welfare of the consumer is focused to more importance. One of the main objectives of macroeconomic policy is to achieving the rate of economic growth in higher level, and especially in the developing countries. However, achieving a high rate of economic growth is not sufficient. It is important that the sustained growth for a longer period of time is needed. And the second important objectives of macroeconomy policies are the low unemployment or higher rate of employment. Most of the economies are in the situation where they are facing a serious problem of unemployment, which any countries are also following the different problems for bringing up the full employment, which may be at the higher level in the less developed economy and the lower level in the developed economy. Unemployment is generally accompanied by the low standard of living, hardship and mental agony. One of the main objectives of macroeconomic policy has been not only to achieve the full employment, but also to maintain at the level, not to the below level. It is to be aimed at the employment in higher level to reduce the unemployment in the lower level. This was especially important after the Second World War. Keynes was one of the major economists pointed out the need to achieve the full employment. However, the today's objective of full employment is given much less important compared to the other objectives of many countries. The most countries have achieved the situation of near full employment. Not everyone has able to a job, but situation is improving every day, and the unemployment level are failing to the level which considered to be close situation to the full employment. The third major objectives of macroeconomic policies is to bring the price stability. It is inflation is defined as a sustained and appreciable increase in the general price level. For price stability, it is necessary for inflation to be at zero or near to zero. The most economies aim at keeping the inflation rate at lower level. The macroeconomic policy has control of inflation as one of its prime objective. In fact, if one had to single out the most important objective of macroeconomic policy today, then it would certainly be inflation. A large part of the government's effort in every economy is devoted to control over the inflation. If one were to analyze the evils of inflation, the foremost among them would be arbitrary way in which the income and the wealth distribution is affected by the inflation. It can be in fact wiping out the purchasing power of individuals' total saving earned in his whole life. The economists have put forward the view that a little amount of inflation is good for the economy because a little inflation is about 2% to 3% will lead to rise and will lead to increase the wages and trigger the growth of economy. Nevertheless, it is generally accepted fact that the high level of inflation are bad to the economy and thus need to be controlled. A rapid changes in the growth of inflation that is unanticipated and thus to adjusted not with the feasible, without doubt it is harmful to the economy. Inflation is a mild rate may be a good for the economy, but it is also the subject to the uncertainty. It is a right to argue that the inflation seems to be a better option to aim and control over the economy and to minimize the stable prices or to become zero rate of inflation. And the fourth important objectives of macroeconomic policy is equilibrium in the payment of the foreign trade. It is equilibrium in the balance of payment. Balance of payment of a country is recorded as all flow of money. It is inflow of money and outflow of money in the country. It is included in the two major categories of transaction. It is the first one is current transaction that includes export and imports of goods and services, in other words visible and invisible trade. And the second one important aspect is focused by the balance of payment. It is capital transactions that includes the inflows and outflows of capital, for example of foreign investments and foreign exchange reserves held in the particular country. Perhaps the more important of these two current account, perhaps the most important of the two is current account, as it is recorded how well a country is performing in terms of exports of goods and as service compared to the imports. A country has to keep earning sufficient currency through its exports if it has to not only provide for its imports but all the more important if it has to rise at the national level into a place of the world. Combination of fiscal and monetary policies can help an economy to come out with the recession, an inflationary situation, and tackle the problem solving to the growth, and even those who are in trade front. Besides these policies, there are some other policies are also like the income policy, growth policy, employment policy and other policies related to the growth of economy. But the major policies are the fiscal policies and the monetary policies. The formulation of the macroeconomic policies. The responsibilities of formulating the macroeconomic policy in any economy falls under the shoulder of the government. It is the government who has not only determined the objectives of the macroeconomic policy, but also has to keep in mind the conflicts between the different objectives, also while making the decisions on the instruments and the target variables to be used in the implementation of the policy objectives. As far as the objectives of macroeconomic policy are concerned, they are determined by the government keeping in mind the economic and the social need of the country. As already mentioned, in an underdeveloped country, the policy objectives are oriented towards the growth and development, whereas the industrialized country, it is obtained towards achieving a situation of full employment and price stability. Thus, the policymaker have to consider all these aspects while framing the policies and deciding on the policy instrument and the target variables. The target variables are to be controlled and to achieve the macroeconomic objectives. In other terms, the target objectives, the target variables are like to bring out the end results. They are recognized goals of the policies. The target of the monetary policy, for example, include the money supply, interest rates and the bank credit, or like what we call it as a target variables in monetary policy. Whereas you can take the fiscal policy, the target of the fiscal policies, for example, it includes the consumption expenditure, investment expenditures and savings. The target can be furtherly divided into the ultimate target and the immediate target, or what we can call it as intermediate target. The ultimate target of the economy would be to attain the zero level of inflation. To be able to serve as the target, a variable should be in 4 qualifications. It's like the variables should have a relationship with the objectives, and this should be clearly understood. The variable should be directly affected by the policy instruments. The influence of non-policy factors should be minimal compared to the policy instruments. And the variables should be measurable, and there should be no time, that should not be a lag involved with this. The government uses a variety of instruments to achieve the macroeconomic objectives. The instruments are the tools with the policy makers to achieve the target. For example, to achieve an exchange rate target, the instrument available with the central bank is the sale or the purchase of foreign exchange. The instrument of monetary policy includes the open market operations, cash reserve ratio, and statutory liquidity ratio. These instruments or the monetary policy influences the target variables of the monetary policy to achieve the macroeconomic policy objectives. The instrument of fiscal policy includes the government expenditure, taxation, and deficit financing. Similar to the instruments of monetary policy, the instruments of fiscal policy influences the target variables of fiscal policy to achieve the macroeconomic policy objectives. The indicators are those economic variables that are signals which indicates whether we are moving close to achieve the target or not is going to be determined. Thus, they are like a feedback, provide the necessary information to the policy makers to whether they are approaching the targets or adjusting or required. The kind of adjustments are required to achieve the target. Indicators are those economic variables that are signals which can indicate whether the goals are moving towards the end or it is going to be achieved. The government faces many problems in trying to attain the objectives. It has to decide some of the following important aspects are like the efforts of the policies on the objectives are delayed and distributed over the time in the uncertainty of the dynamic world. There may exist a delay in obtaining a full and complete information about the actual state of the objectives. For example, about the real income and employment. The processing and analysis of information may involve a lot of time. The objectives may be attached not only to the policy instruments but also to the development which are not related to the policies. These are the major problems and hurdles while making the different policies related to the macroeconomy. So the next we'll discuss about the monetary policy and the fiscal policy. So what are the major things that comes under the monetary policy and the fiscal policy will be discussed in this. The monetary policies is an operation of the monetary authorities of the country is to achieve a certain well-defined macroeconomic goals. It is in general the central bank of the country which undertakes the implement the monetary policy. It operates through the changes in the quantity of money. Hence, the monetary policy has to be the immediate impact in the money market. The monetary policy is an operation of the monetary authorities where it is used to control over the entire economic activity in the country. The monetary policy is to be noted that the how much wider monetary policies are noted that how much wider that the credit policy, which both are administered by the central government of the country. The central bank has control over this particular policy, and the credit policy is concerned with the changes in the supply of credit, and the monetary policy with the changes in the supply of money. To avoid this confusion, often the two are clubbed together under the head of monetary policy. Monetary policy refers to the use of instruments under the control of central bank, it is RBI, to control and regulate the availability and the cost and the use of money and credit. According to Johnson, monetary policy is defined as the policy employing central bank's control of supply of money as an instrument for achieving the objectives of general economic policy. The instruments which comes under the control of monetary policy, it is formulated on the basis of the objectives of the monetary policy. The main objective which the monetary policy aims at achieving the economic growth and the higher rate of employment and stable price equality of distributing the income as well as the wealth. A stable balance of payment and the many other depending on the need of time. To achieving this objective, monetary policy has to, at the level of disposable instrument which gives the central bank the power to control over the money supply, hence it is to be achieved by its objectives. These instruments can be divided into two major categories, that are quantitative or general measures and qualitative or selective measures. Quantitative or general measures of monetary policy, which is focusing primarily on or which includes the open market operations. What is open market operations? It is the sale and purchase of government securities and treasury bills by the central bank. It is an instrument of the monetary control which the most powerful and which is the most widely used by the central bank. The central bank carries out the open market operation through the commercial banks. Hence, these operations affect the bank deposits and reserves and thus influence the capacity to create the money. There are major things that related to the instruments of monetary policy that are a contradiction of a monetary policy aims to reducing that the supply of money in the hand of a public and also to decrease the creation of credit. To achieve this, it offers the government securities and the treasury bills for sale of securities, which is through the commercial banks. When the public and other institutions are purchasing these securities through a check which is drawn in the commercial banks, there is a withdrawal of money from this account with the banks. Hence, there are occurred decrease in the cash reserves of the bank, thereby reducing their capacity to create the credit. And an expansionary monetary policy, it aims at raising the supply of money in the hands of the public and also increasing the creation of the credit. To achieve this, it purchases the government securities and treasury bills through a commercial banks. When the public and other institutions are selling these securities, there is an increase in flow of money to the account of the bank. Hence, there is an occurrence in an increase in the bank deposits and also the cash reserves. Improve the capacity of credit creation. There is an increase in the supply of money. The effectiveness of open market operations. The open market operations can be used as a most powerful instrument of monetary policy. In the US, UK and other countries, you can take it is recorded as one of the most effective policy to control over the money supply. There are the major advantages of open market operations, which includes they are highly flexible and can be used widely with the varying accounts, and it is easily reversible in time, and it can be often used in widely differing amounts. Unlike other instruments of monetary policy, they do not involve any public announcements. Hence, they do not have any announcements effort. That is, there are no reaction in the market consequent to the open market operations. For open market operation to be a successful, at least three conditions they need to satisfy. These conditions are like: it is necessary that the market for government securities, that gilt-edged market, is well developed and well organized, and it is necessary that the central bank has enough capacity to buy and sell the government securities. It is necessary that the pursuit of these operations, the brief consideration in the central bank is only the monetary control. In India, it seems that out of these conditions, only the conditions are deemed to be satisfied. The central banks of the country, that the Reserve Bank of India has the sufficient capacity to buy and sell the securities. As far as the condition, the government marketable securities is not well recognized as well organized in the market. Regarding the conditions, that the RBI has often been weighted down by the consideration other than the monetary control and more towards the public debt management. The second important aspects of the qualitative or general measures as the instrument of monetary policy, which includes the commercial banks, which is, we call it as variation in reserve requirements. The commercial banks maintain a certain proportion of their time and demand liabilities in the form of cash reserves. These can be divided into two major categories, as like the required reserve. There are cash balances which the banks hold to meet out their statutory reserve requirements. This is a legal requirement imposed on the banks by the central bank. The purpose of these reserves is to safeguard the interest of the depositors and to prevent the banking system from the total collapse. It is also enable the central bank to be able to control the liquidity. As per these requirements, the banks has to maintain a certain minimum reserves deposit ratio. Hence, the fraction of each bank's total deposit have to be maintained a cash balance with the central bank. There are reserves which mentioned by the central bank to be followed by the commercial banks, or like it is contradictory. It is contractionary monetary policy. It raises the cash reserve ratio with the upward revision in the cash reserve ratio. The banks are required to hold a larger portion of their cash balance with the central bank for the same amount that they are having as liabilities. To reduce the bank's ability to extend the loans, to decrease the money supply in the market. It is essence that the CRR inbounds the funds are available in the bank, and expansionary of monetary policy, it is reduced the cash reserve ratio with the reduction in the reserve requirements of the ratio. The banks are required to hold a smaller portion of their cash balance with the central bank for the purpose of the same amount of their liabilities. This improves the bank's ability to extend the loans and it is increasing to the money supply. The second important aspect is related to the excess reserves maintained by the commercial banks. These are the reserves in excess required to the reserves. A part of this may be held in the form of cash in hand or from the wallet of from the other banks. The rest may be kept in the form of balances with the central bank. They are held in the banks for meeting the basic of the two purpose related to the currency drains, which is net withdrawable of the currency by the depositors, clearing the drains, which is net loss of the cash due to the interbank clearing of checks. The effectiveness of variations in reserve requirement as compared to the open market operations, it is also often aligned that the variation in the reserve requirements are an inferior tool of monetary policy because that they lead to discontinue the changes in the deposits and reserves. The changes in reserve requirements are noteworthy that they produce the announcement effect. The bank can give the sufficient notice of the changes, so the loss can be reduced gradually by the bank having the sufficient time and adjusting the portfolio accordingly. During the time of inflation, the reserve banks would increase rapidly. Hence, the banks would not find it out any difficulty to meet out the higher cash reserve ratio, and thus they would not face any problem in giving their complete cooperation to the monetary authorities in controlling the money policy. Often, the central banks are unable to use the open market operations for the purpose of monetary control. Hence, it is required in the variation of the reserves. If wishes to ensure that the monetary stability be available in the economy, it is also increasing to felt that the variable reserve ratios on its own is not sufficient instrument of controlling the money supply. Thus, to make it an effective, important instrument that need to be a supplement for other instruments of monetary policy. Next one related to the statutory liquidity ratio. Besides cash reserve ratio, the banks are subject to control through the another requirement, statutory liquidity ratio. The SLR has been defined as the statutory requirement where the banks are required to maintain a certain fixed proportion of their demand and time liabilities in the form of designated liquid assets. Under the statutory liquidity ratio, the banks statutorily required to maintain a certain fixed proportion of their demand and time liabilities in the form of designated liquid assets. This ratio of liquid assets to demand and time liabilities is known as statutory liquidity ratio. The purpose behind the statutory liquidity ratio was to prevent the commercial banks from meeting out or negotiating with the impact of increase in cash reserve ratio by converting their liquid assets into cash, so that their loanable fund remains inactive. An increase in statutory liquidity ratio thus imparts the bank's leveraged capacity to pump more money into the economy. The bank rate policy is the next important aspect. The bank rates or discount rates is the rate of interest at which a central bank rediscount the eligible bills of exchange or other commercial papers. When the banks are short of cash requirements, they borrow from the central bank by getting the bills of exchange. Will be rediscounted. In simple sentence, we can call it as the central bank on the loans and advances made by it to be in commercial banks. The central bank is the lender of last resort for the commercial banks. The bank rate or a discount rate is a rate of interest at which the central bank rediscount the eligible bills of exchange and other commercial papers. It is at the discretion of the central bank to change the bank rate when the bank purchases on the different instruments. They will be using this particular concept for changing the ratios. As well as the expansionary of the monetary policy, it lowers the bank rate. Hence, it becomes more cheaper for the commercial banks to borrow from the central banks at the discount window. Thus, a decrease in the bank rate increases the money supply. A decrease in the bank rate, which follows a fall in the market rate of interest. All others in the bank revises their lending rates downwards. When the central banks pursues a contradictory monetary policy, it raises the bank rate. Hence, it becomes costlier for commercial banks to borrow from the central bank's rediscount window, discouraging them to borrow from the central bank. Thus, an increase in the bank rate decreases the money supply. An increase in the bank rate follows a rise in the market value of interest for all other securities in the market. Effectiveness of bank rate policy, it is difficult to predict the effectiveness of the changes in the bank rate on the amount of banks borrowing. This effect will depends on the number of factors like extent to which the banks is depending on borrowed reserves. The second important one, extent to which the differential and banks are being providing the lending rates and the borrowed rates is sensitive to the bank's demand for the borrowed reserves. To extent which the other rates of interest changes in the response to the changes in borrowed reserves. Demand for the loans and the extent to which the loans are available from the sources. There are some limitations are also associated with the bank's rate policy. It is a bank rate is a given rate. It is strictly comparison to other rates. Also, the changes are discontinuous. The changes in the bank rate have announced efforts. That is, there are the reaction in the market due to the mere announcement of changes which are being brought about the bank rates. However, the central bank may avoid bringing about the changes in the bank rates. Over the year, the flexibility in money market has gone down. Hence, the response of the money and the credit markets get changes in the bank rate. It is very adequate for the monetary policies effectiveness. In certain economies, there was developed the kind of private markets for loans, and those banks which are in the needs of the loans borrow from the excess reserves. The next one, The repo rate and the reverse repo rate, shortly what we call it as repo rate, is a repurchase rate, and reverse repo rate or the repurchase of the possession. What we have given, that the repo rate is a rate at which the central banks infuses the short-term liquidity to the system. It is, in simple term, it is the rate of the interest in which the commercial banks lends to the commercial banks, which borrows from the central bank, or central banks lends to the commercial banks. And the reverse repo rate is the rate at which the banks are parking their short-term excess liquidity with the central bank in exchange of the government securities. It is the rate at which the central banks borrows from the commercial banks. Hence, the repo rate, what we consider as the reversed one, it is a reverse repo rate is the return earned by the banks on their excess fund with the central bank. An increase in that the rate which tempt the banks to park their short-term liquidity with the central bank, thus sequencing out to lose the cash from the system, which is in turn it is helping in to reduce the inflationary pressures. When the yields on the government securities goes up, the market, what we can say, is a liquid crunch, and the liquid rates to retail and the corporate sector, it becomes hardened one. Difference between the kind of a bank rate and the repo rate. The bank rate are the rate at which the RBI provides the finance to the commercial banks in India. Bank can avail the different types of the refinance from the RBI at the rate that are linked to the bank. Then the banks can borrow at the rate depending on the eligibility to refinance. The repo rate is, on another hand, it is money market instruments which enables the collateralized short-term borrowings and lending through sales or purchase operations of debt instruments. Under a repo transaction, a builder of securities sell them to an investors. The reverse repo rate is linked to the repo rate. The spread between the reverse repo rate and the repo rate are maintained generally at the 100 basic points, with the repo rate is being higher of the two. The second important parameter is a qualitative or selective measures of monetary policy. The quantitative measures control the total volume of credit and the cost of credit in the economy, and hence the expansion or the contraction in total amount of credit and thus the supply of money. In the another hand, you can take the qualitative measures of control the direction and distribution of the credit in the economy. This can be in the two important aspects. The first one is related to the positive aspects of these measures can be used to encourage the flow of credit in particular direction. Negative aspects of these measures can be used to restrict the flow of credit into a particular sector. The important qualitative or selective measures, which includes the rationing of credit. So the concept of rationing of credit is resorted to when there is an occurrence for the shortage of institutional powerful and financially strong sectors which in fact may not really need of credit. may be able to capture the major shares of the credit. The sector which may in fact the tire need to fund may not be able to procure them. To prevent the kind of a situation from occurring, the central bank may resort to the credit rationing, changing the terms and conditions are associated with the bank loans. It is charging the rate of interest which should be higher for the bank loans which go beyond certain limit. Setting limits for the quantum of availing the loan to the large firms and industries are the kind of things being used for rationing of credit. Second one, the change in the margin requirements. So what is change in the margin requirements? This is a tool of monetary policy that works indirectly to influence the lending and regulate the capital market. The margin requirement specifies the minimum maintainable ratio of the values of securities charged to the amount borrowed. The changes in margin requirements are used to control the speculative activities. If the wholesaler start hoarding some of the particular essential goods so that they can create a shortage and push up the price of the goods, then the case of central bank can raise the margin requirement for these goods. The next important aspect is a moral suasion. This combines persuasion and the pressure which a central bank asserts to bring erring banks in line with the functions of central bank directives. The central banks can exercise these letters, meeting and discussion with the banks can vary the matter. In fact, the moral suasion is only the instructions which can be used for both quantitative and qualitative credit controls. The moral suasion is a combination of the persuasion of the pressure which a central bank can ascertain to bring erring banks in line so that they function in accordance with the central bank directives. The next important aspect is direct action. This refers to the coercive action resorted to by the central bank against those banks who do not function in accordance to the directives of central bank. This may be by the way of denial of the discrepancies, is a discretionary rediscounting facilities, charging of penal interest rates, etc. comes under this particular category. Effectiveness of qualitative or credit control measures, this will be depends on the number of factors, which can be like the extent of the restriction on the credit. It's like the availability of finance from the other sources, the extent to which the supply is not able to fulfill for the demand, or the major things which may happen. So the next important policy that we need to see about the fiscal policy. The government of a country can influence the economy not only through the monetary policy but also through the fiscal policy also. The fiscal policies refers to the government policy which is regarding the government expenditure, taxation and public borrowing with a view to achieving certain well-defined macroeconomic objectives. It refers the more concern towards the government financing. The government policies of changing its taxation, public expenditure programs which is intended to achieve its objectives. It was only with the outcoming of Keynes that the fiscal policy gained importance. The prior to Keynes, monetary policy was more popular. Also, the other economists or the Adam Smith strongly propagated the beliefs that in an economy the role of government should kept in minimum. An economy which functioned on its own without any interface of any kind of ideal economy. It was believed an economy would also functioning at the full employment level, hence the government's role should be limited to maintaining a law and order and providing the essential service to the public. The coming of the Great Depression and the failure of monetary policy to tackle the severe unemployment problems arising in made one realize the need for fiscal policy. Further, the new economists like Keynes with emphasis on aggregate demand strengthened by belief that the time was right to renew the faith of public with the effect of fiscal policy. And you need to know what are the instruments that comes under the category of the fiscal policies. There are the instruments are like deficit policy, taxation policy, government expenditure and public borrowing. So the thing is here to implement the fiscal policy, the government has providing the several instruments to control over. The first instrument is a deficit policy, which we call it as financing the budgetary deficit. It is an excess of government expenditure over its income. They are taking a loan from the Reserve Bank of India by the government to meet out the budgetary deficits, or the instrument which can provide the financial facility to the government to overcome their liabilities, to overcome their obligations. And the second important aspect is related to the taxation, is a taxation policies. The most important source of the revenue to the government in most of the countries is a taxation. In the developing countries, the government making an attempt to increasing in the proportion of the national income which is collected in the form of the taxes, which can be analyzed under the two major headings. We call it as the direct taxes. The direct taxes are going to be divided into the corporate income tax, which are collected from the firm's economic profit. These forms a small proportion to the total revenue of the government in many reasons. Since the corporate sector forms a very small portion of the economy, it contributes to the total revenue will also be small. Often to encourage the industrial development, the government offers incentives in the form of tax rebates and investment subsidies. However, it is important to note that in spite of all the problems of corporate income taxes are easier to collect compared to the personal income taxes. The personal income tax, again, it is an account for very small portion of the total revenue of the government. For many reasons, a large population of the people may have the lower income and thus not in the position to pay the taxes. There are administrative weaknesses which are responsible for the tax evasion. And the third important aspect is focusing on the taxes on wealth and property can accounted for the large portion of the total revenue to the government for the many reasons. Since they are collected from the rich class which has the property, that they are not likely to have adverse influence on the incentives to work. Such tax can reduce the income and wealth inequalities to some extent. The second part is the indirect income tax. Under this category, the first one, we have the sales tax and the excise duty. Instead of that, we have the GST, goods and services tax, to be paid by the people for the purchasing of goods. Indirect taxes are paid, and the customs duty or include the export duty and import duties that paid for whoever involving with the trading and the manufacturing of goods that directly exporting and importing they need to pay. And like the next important aspect, the third important thing is related to the government expenditure. Since the government, there is a kind of a Great Depression, the government's role in economic activity is continuously on the increase. In the several reasons, it was realized that the private sector was not in the position to pull the economy out of depression on its own. The private sector did not possess either the ability or the willingness to embark on the ambitious projects which were necessary to put the economy on the path of growth and development. Hence, it was realized that the government expenditure is imperative for an economy in the form of investments in capital goods industries, building the infrastructure and payment of wages and salaries. Besides, the government has to fulfill various social obligations which includes expenditure on education, public health services, unemployment compensation, pensions and other welfare considerations. The last one, public borrowing. Through a public borrowing is the second most important source of the revenue. It means the taxation is the most important source in terms of generating the revenue. It is unlike a taxes, all the borrowing from the public must be repaid in future. The public borrowing can be taken into two important forms. The first one, compulsory loan, where the bonds are issued by the government for the period varying from 5 to 10 years. The employee's contribution towards the provident fund falls under this category. And the second important aspects like the voluntary loans, where bills and securities are issued by the government. Since the taxation is insufficient to finance the growing public expenditure, the government in most countries has to resort to borrowing from the public. The developmental expenditure are increasing at such a great speed that in most of the countries, the government has to finance these expenditure by raising loans from the public, which we call it as the deficit financing has also often been included in the instrument of the fiscal policy. So in conclusion of this topic of macroeconomic policies are very essential for the growth of a country. So we all aware of there are different types of policies are there in the government related to the income, related to the expenses, related to the employment. But there are two important policies are gaining the advantages for the growth of economy, like fiscal policies and the monetary policies. The monetary policy is widely used and the process that has been authenticated by the central bank in order to bring that particular policy into the market, that going to be regulate the money supply in the market, and they are fixing a different requirements, different reserve requirements to the banks for the purpose of making the sustainable growth in the economy. The second important aspect of the fiscal policy or direct the control of the government in order to generate the revenue, in order to make the expenses for the welfare of the people. So these two policies are highly essential for the growth, for the development of the economy, as well as to control over the inflation in the country. Thank you.